Hello and welcome back. So in this video, we are going to cover some of the basic scene building essentials that you would probably use on any given new project or throughout your game development process here in Unity. So all the different steps we take are the fundamental building blocks to get yourself prepared and understand things that you're going to encounter more often than you think. So here we are from our previous scene and previous video where we had our sample scene and we created a bunch of objects, different types of objects. We had some material that we added on there. So let's go ahead and start from the beginning. I do have some scenes here from last time as well when we did the create and manage scene video. And so I'm going to go ahead and remove these. And then I'm going to go ahead and create a brand new scene from scratch. So that gives you practice and a chance to see it again for a second time. So I'm going to go ahead and select level 1 here. I'm going to right click and then I'm going to go ahead and delete. It's going to ask me, do I want to keep that? No. I'm going to go ahead and remove that. And then I'm also going to right click and delete level 2. And here I have my sample scene. So let's start off with a brand new scene. So I'm going to right click, go up to create, and I'm going to go to scene. It's going to ask me, hey, what is this scene, or what's this name of this scene that I want to create? And so even though I did create a previous level 1, I'm going to go ahead and just redo it again so that you see that we have it as a new scene and a new name. So I'm going to go ahead and say, hey, this is level 1 in my game. I'm going to hit enter. Now I'm still currently on the previous sample scene. So I'm going to go ahead and double click on level 1 to open up this brand new scene we just created, level 1. You can name it whatever you want. You can call it test scene, practice, scene building, whatever name you want to give it is up to you based on what you're doing. And we're in the middle of like the processing and the learning stages. So the name you give it is up to you and what you want to call your specific scene. Later on, as you are starting to develop a working idea of a game, you want to make sure that you name your scenes based on what information or what the player is going to be doing in that particular scene. In our case, I'm going to go ahead and give it the example level number 1 here. And as I look at this brand new scene, I'm given my 2 default game objects, our main camera. This is where the main camera is going to look in on the actual game itself, and our directional light. Each of these has predetermined transform positions in the world that you can use as a starter point, and then you can change and manipulate these 2 game objects as needed. So let's go ahead and create a few new game objects and look at manipulating them and changing their appearance with the inspector and the previous materials that we created. So I'm going to go ahead and go up to the plus, or you can right click in the hierarchy and I can go down to 3D object and I'm going to go over to plane. I'm going to use this plane as a ground object so that I can build on it. The idea is, in this example, is that we're going to build a simple model using the 3D primitive shapes that Unity has to offer. And so what I create, if you want to follow along and create the same thing I do, that would be great. Or if you want to test the boundaries, come up with your own idea and have this very first level 1 design based on these primitive shapes on an idea that you may come up with. This is all about practice now. So this plane here, that's the default name. So if I was to hit enter, I'm going to have it say plane. It's put this plane into a specific position. So right here, it set this position to 0, 0, 0. Its scale is 1, 1, and 1 on the X, Y, and Z. And so went down, I right click, I created my 3D object, I created plane. You can do the same thing again with that plus in that upper left hand corner, arrow, 3D, and if you were to create that plane again, here it's going to want to, it already recognizes you have a plane with the name, or the object with the name of plane, so it's going to put that number 1 there, but obviously we don't want 2 planes here, so I'm going to go ahead and remove that. But that's 2 different ways on how to create your object. And so here I have my plane. If for some reason when you created your plane object, if your position is not 0 on the X, 0 on the Y, and 0 on the Z, you can go ahead and use the 3 little dots and you can reset this. But when you reset, it's going to change everything back to 0, 0, 0. So if you only want to set up the position, you can go 0, 0, and 0. And so I don't want this to be plain. I'm going to call this my ground object. So I can, on this object here in the hierarchy, I can right click and I can rename here. Or if I select that object, I can go over to the inspector and I can rename it here as well. And I'm going to call this ground. And so I have my ground object. Because we used a pre-built game object from Unity, it comes with a few extra components that are given for us, which kind of gets the ball rolling. And so because this is the ground, I don't want this to be white. I'm going to use our previous materials. And so if I go to the project folder, in my assets from last time, we created a materials folder, and inside here, I have a brown color that I'm going to use for the ground. So I'm going to take this material, click, drag, and drop on my ground, and there I have my ground object. If I go ahead and manipulate the gizmo in the corner, I can move this around. So now my X, so I'm looking down on the actual ground. X is going left and right. Your Z, your forward, is going forward or up and down. And then your Y is coming at you into the scene. And so we have our actual ground object. What happens if we want to manipulate this? Let's say it's too small. I can grab the hand tool and let's say hold the Alt key. I'm going to kind of move this around a little bit in the scene there. Let's say it's a little bit too small. Maybe I want to double this size here. I could go to the scale tool on this ground, make sure the ground object is selected, and I can manipulate this. I can change its scale in each direction on its own, or you can change its values over here in the scale. And let's say I want this to be a little bit larger of a square here. So if I go ahead and grab that red and I start stretching this till it reaches the lines in my grid, you can see that this is 1.9971. If I want this to be precise, I can then change this value to 2 on the X. And I want to go and change this upward on the Z. So the Y is going up. I'm going to grab that blue handle and I'm going to stretch that as well so that I have a 2 by 2 square. You can see here that the Z is not quite 2, but I'm going to go ahead and type in the number 2 and hit enter. And now my ground object has been manipulated with the scale tool, and I confirmed it in the inspector using the scale values. So I've got a 2 on the X and a 2 on the Z. My Y is at 1 on the height. And so we've changed our appearance. We've also manipulated this object. I've got some changes that I've made. I'm going to go ahead and save my scene. You can do a Control S for a shortcut on the PC or Command S on the Mac, which I am on right now. Or you can look up to File and then Save as well. So you save your scene. Go ahead and save often. Whenever you're building anything, you're going to want to save often, just so in case the application has a bug or gets out of hand, that you have what you've been working on is saved locally. Later on, we'll cover some version control and saving your project to the cloud as you're building. And so here I have my ground plane. At this point, take some time, go through and create some additional game objects to build maybe some walls, maybe a little house, whatever you want to, as long as you're using the shapes that are given to you. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create some walls and then maybe some buildings in here using the different shapes that are available to me. This particular object, so as I'm building here, I'm going to use the cube for some actual pillars in the corners. And I created this brand new cube. And if you look here where it placed it, it didn't place it right in the center. It's not quite 0, 0, 0. So I could go 0, 0, 0, and then I'm all reset. And then from here, I'm going to go ahead and finish out my build. So originally, I went ahead and I created my cube, moved it into position, and then I created another cube by right-clicking, going to 3D object, and creating a cube. You can also duplicate an object as well. So here on my cube, I can right-click and I can duplicate this. There's my next cube, and then I can then hold the control or the command, and I'm going to move this into position. So it looks like all four corners are going to be 10 and 10 on the Z and the X. So I can duplicate again, or actually you can do Command D as well, or Control D to do a duplication. And then I'm going to put this in the other corner, and there I have all of these pillars. Now it's left the name as cube. You could essentially, if you wanted to rename all these ones here, this one here is actually top right pillar or top right column. And you can actually apply this name so you know where it is in the world. So this was top right pillar. Then this was top left pillar. And then I'm going to provide some additional barriers in between these as well. And this particular one here, I am going to want to stretch this so that way it's fitting in between these two pillars here. So this cube is that I'm going to shrink it, and if I move my gyroscope, so I'm going to look down on this. I want this to shrink its X. So I'm going to go 0.5 so it's a little thinner, and then I can grab the scale tool, and then I can scale this up until it reaches each of the objects, and then I can clean up that information. So I could go all the way through or somewhat close to it. And so if I put this at 20, looks like it's a little bit farther at 20. And let's figure this out. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to grab this orange, and I'm going to apply this orange to this cube now. I'm going to call this will be the right fence. I'm going to rotate and move in, and you notice that this is going into the other objects there. If you are okay with that in the design, for right now, that's okay. Or if you wanted these to be touching, we would have to then manipulate and say we're going to go, and if I went to 18, it's not quite 18. But if I went to 19, so what I could do is I can zoom in here. So I can double click on the object, use the hand tool, and look, and it looks like this object is touching each of the sides. So I'm going to get this back going again. Zoom out, scroll out on the wheel on the mouse. And now I can take this right fence, Command D to duplicate this. I'm going to use the move tool, and I'm going to move this over to the other side as well. Okay. Now you notice that when I'm using this right fence is touching, but when I go to this one here that's going to be the left fence, you can see how that cube is actually not in the right spot. That top left one is not quite at 10. Okay, there we go. So we're all set there. And then I'm going to need to get one on the top and the bottom. And we'll call this top fence. I'm going to set this at 0, 0, and 0. Use on that object, we're going to use the move tool, and we're going to move this up to position at 10. It's going to be scaling out to 19 on the X, and on the Z, this is going to be 0.5. And I'm going to use that orange as well. And then I'm going to do Command or Control D to duplicate this. This is going to be the bottom fence, and then I'm going to move this into position. And there we have sort of a kind of a corral in a sense. I've got some pillars on the outside, those white boxes. I've got the fence in the orange and the ground in the brown. Control S or Command S to save our work. And you notice that we are having, or we've created quite a bit of objects now. What happens if we start creating a lot more, which we will as we go through the rest of this video? What happens if this thing gets over cluttered? The next thing I want to cover is the parent-child relationship, where we're going to provide a parent game object which is going to house all the children that would belong with it. In a sense, we have all these objects here that make up, say, the environment that we're working in. So I could create what they call an empty game object. So I'm going to go ahead and right click, and I'm going to scroll down to create empty. And here I have a empty game object. The reason why they call it an empty game object, because it only comes with the transform. All game objects have a transform. That's the position, rotation, scale of that game object in the world. There are no other components, therefore they call this one the empty game object. And then I'm going to go ahead and label this as my environment. And I'm going to go ahead and reset this to position 0 on the X, Y, and Z. And then now I can take all of these objects and I can move them into the environment. So I can select the first one, and you can drag and drop these one at a time. So I can take the ground, I can drag and drop, or I can select the first one. I can hold Shift, select the last one. Now they're all selected, and I can drag and drop on my environment. And now you notice that there is this arrow, the drop down arrow. This has now created that parent-child relationship between two different game objects. These are now all the children of the environment game objects there. So I'm going to go ahead and save my work. And so at this point, go ahead and continue on putting together a scene that is consistent of different buildings or different shapes that make up a real world structure in a sense. And then let's see where you're at. So hopefully by now you've taken some of the shapes and created some additional structures on your scene here. I went ahead and I created a simple factory using the cubes and the cylinders here. So I added the material. I've got this blue building. I've got the air vents and a door. And so these are as single game objects. I'm going to go ahead and create these as the factory. I'm going to put these into a new empty game object. So I'm going to right click, go down to create empty, and I'm going to call this factory. I'm going to go ahead and set this factory to 0, 0, and 0. And if I go ahead and select and I go to the move tool, you see how this factory, this actually is right here at the center. 0, 0, 0. But my factory is off-centered. So if I decide to add my building, my door, and my 2 air vents as children of the factory at this point, it will still provide this offset. And so what I mean by that is, let me go ahead and do that. So I'm going to grab all these objects, and I'm going to make them children of the factory. And each of these will then have its new corresponding values to the factory itself. And then I can move the factory wherever I decide that I would like to move the factory itself. And so now there's another representation of the environment. What I could do is that this factory could be consistent of the environment, so I could make this a child of the environment as well. Or what I could do is maybe later on in your game you have other prefabs and you want to reuse this. So we had a prefabs folder from last time. I'm going to grab this factory and I'm going to make a prefab of this factory in case I want to make and reuse it again on a different scene. And again, you notice that the prefabs are indicated by the blue text versus the gray text. I'm going to save my scene. And so in the last thing that I want to cover in this video that you're going to use often is your scripting files. Now we'll cover that later on other parts of the actual course, but in this case, just to get started, is that let's say this scene needs a player. Normally a player is going to be consistent of the capsule. Usually the capsule is representative of the player. I'm going to go ahead and give that object the name player. You see the player is stuck in the building there. I'm going to go ahead and reset the player back to 0, 0, 0 in the world. I already have some white elements here. I'm going to go to my materials and let's see which color did I not use yet, the green. So I'm going to grab the green material and I'm going to add the green to the player. And then I'm going to drag the player up a little bit. I'm actually going to let it kind of levitate off the ground for a moment, just because when we add a new component here, you'll see why I do that in a minute. So how I have my player here. in order to get the player to move, we use a scripting file to provide behavior to a given object. In this case, we're going to create a player controller, and we're going to add this to our player object as a reference. We're not going to create any code, but it will be there as a reference. So in my assets folder, I'm going to make a new folder called scripts. So a new folder. This one is going to be labeled scripts. And then I'm going to double click on my script folder. And then I want to create our first C# script. Now, whenever we create our scripting files, you want to take note of how you create them, so that way it doesn't provide any conflicts later on when you're using them. And if they get large, it's hard to figure out if this is one of the errors. So I'm going to go ahead and create a brand new script. So I'm going to right click. I'm going to go up to create, and I'm going to go up to the very top to C# script. Now, before I click on this, if for some reason you accidentally hit the enter key before renaming it, Unity, whenever you create something, it wants you to rename it or keep the name that it's given and then hit enter to save that. With scripting files, the name is very important. That name ties to the class that it's given. So if I was to create my C# script, the name it's given here is new behavior script. And if I accidentally just hit enter to save that, when it creates that file for me, in the inspector, I've got a preview of this. You can see how here it's showing that this class, it says new behavior script. I don't want this. I want to name my classes or my C# script files for what this object is. So I don't want to come over here, right click and rename, because if I try to rename this, and let's just say I say player as the name of the file, it's not going to rename the class name, and that could cause some conflict or compiler errors later on. So if your program does not let you run, it could be because the class name does not match the actual file name. So what I would recommend is that I would recommend, if you haven't created any code, I would right click, I would delete this, and then I'm going to go ahead and start over. So I'm going to go ahead and right click, create. I'm going to go up to C# script, and we'll just call this player for an example. So I'll call that player. I accidentally typed a capital L there, and you can see that it has that. So I'm going to go ahead and need to rename that. And I'll show you a secondary choice on how to fix that. Now, in order for me to use this player script on my player object, I need to add this as a component. So I can take this file, I can drag and I can drop it on my player, and that's going to add it over here. Or I can take and drag and drop it to the inspector, so I've got a copy of that. But let's go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and rename this. So I'm going to right click. I'm going to go to rename. I'm going to fix that capital L to a lowercase l. It's going to fix the name of the file, but it's not going to fix the class. So if I wanted to fix the class, let's say I had a bunch of code and on accident I had a wrong name. I want to make sure that Unity is first opening up our code editor correctly. When it comes to using the scripting editor inside of Unity, if you're on a PC, you want to make sure that Unity is detecting that IDE that you're going to use. In our case, it's going to be Visual Studio 2022 on the PC. So the first thing you want to do before we create any of our scripting files, or if you have created your scripting files, you can still do this after the fact. It's not going to mess anything up, but you want to make sure this setting is taken care of right away. But if you happen to already have created your script files, double check that Unity is seeing Visual Studios. And so on the PC, you're going to go up to the Edit tab, and then I'm going to go all the way down to Preferences. And on the Preferences pop-up window, you're going to look for this External Tools. This is going to be the same process on the Mac, which I'll show you next, but it's in a different location on the Mac. But we're still going to go to the Preferences, make sure you're on external tools and over here to the external script editor, and you want to verify that Microsoft Visual Studio 2022 or the version that you have installed is being seen by Unity. So I'm going to make sure I select that I have that selected. And then I'm going to go ahead and I want to go ahead and regenerate the project files. That's if you do have some already created. It's just going to reconnect the files themselves. I'm also going to want to double check that, yep, that's ready to go. And that's the main thing there, is we want to make sure that the external script editor is locating the correct software that you want to use here on a PC. Next, we'll show you how to find this on the Mac. So on the Mac, you have to go over to the Apple symbol. Go to Unity first and to Settings. You are going to be changing the preferences. And here on the Mac version, if you go to Assets, they have properties, but it's not the same properties. Under Unity, you have to go to Settings here on the Mac and see how it says Preferences now. Is that we're looking for this external tools, and you want to verify that the external scripting editor is in fact the Visual Studio that I recommended earlier. And so here on the Mac, I'm using the Visual Studio for Mac, and I have that assigned. And that way I know when I open this file, it's going to open up the correct code editor for me. And so now I'm going to go ahead and double click on this scripting file. This is going to open up the Visual Studio. So now my Visual Studio is loading my player script file. And now what I can do is I can come up here and I can fix the capital L to a lowercase l for the word player. And then I'm going to want to save this. Whenever you're creating your scripts, you'll notice that there's a little dot up there that's indication of unsaved changes. I could go to File and then Save. Here on the Mac, it's Command S or Control S on the PC. And I want to save that. And then it's going to recompile with Unity. I'm going to go back over here. And there you have it. You can notice the file name has been changed correctly. So now our player is in fact has the correct name. So later on when we go into other scripting files, we'll cover that again. But that's the essentials that you'll need to know to get yourself started. If you need to add other components. If this is the player and we want this player to move around in the world, we're going to need to add the rigid body component to allow this object to move with physics. So over here in the inspector, I can add a new component, and that's going to be under the physics category. And then I'm going to look for the rigid body. The rigid body is going to give this object real world gravity. It's going to use gravity. It comes with a mass property here of 1. The values are in kilograms. So here it says 1 kilogram. So you have to do if you're trying to provide real world calculations, you're going to need to figure out, okay, how much does an actual person weigh? Maybe it's 50, 60 kilograms, 10 kilograms. Convert that from pounds, and that way you have an actual number to work with. But the reason why I'm going to leave this off the ground here is because if I was to then do a save on my scene and I go to the play to play this scene, it's going to compile, and you notice that the player's capsule falls to the ground and stops on the ground. That's because Unity is providing physics on our player's capsule, and the reason why it's colliding with the ground object is because not only does the player have a rigid body, it also has a capsule collider, and so does the ground. So if I go to environment and I go to ground, the ground also has a collider. In order for two things to interact with one another with physics, they both need a collider of some kind. There's all kinds of different colliders to use, but also one of those objects that's doing the colliding needs to have a rigid body attached to it. So you may not need to apply gravity to that object, but one of the objects that's doing the collision is going to need to have that rigid body. Otherwise, these two are not going to collide. So if I go out of plane mode for a minute, and let's say I uncheck that capsule collider there, and then I go back to play mode, my player just fell through the ground. That's because there was no collider. So gravity with the rigid body is taking effect, but there's been no collision because the collider was deselected. And so those are the things that you could come into encounter as you're starting to build out your games. Hopefully this essentials tutorial covered the basics to get yourself started, and then we'll see you on the next video. Thanks for watching.